Hey everyone. Throwaway account for obvious reasons. I've been a CEO for a little over a decade, and for the most part, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of how my company worked. We run a mid-sized logistics company, warehouses, trucking, distribution centers, the whole deal. I built this business from the ground up, so I always assumed I knew how things worked at every level. That was, until I decided to go undercover. Not for a TV show or anything. Just for me. I wanted to see what was really happening, outside the filtered reports from my managers. So I made up a fake identity, posed as a temp worker, and spent 2 weeks working inside one of my own distribution centers. And let me tell you, what I found out completely changed how I see my company. I told my leadership team that I'd be on vacation for a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, I signed up with a temp agency under a fake name, let's call me Mike, shaved my usual beard, wore old clothes, and even changed my posture a bit. I got placed in one of our distribution centers about 2 states away, far enough that no one would recognize me. From day one, I realized I had underestimated just how different it would feel to be on the ground floor. The warehouse was loud, busy, and, honestly, a little overwhelming. I'd seen these places from the outside before, toured them plenty of times, but being inside as a worker? It was a whole different beast. The air smelled like cardboard, oil, and stale coffee. Forklifts zoomed by, workers moved quickly, and everything had this unspoken rhythm. It was like stepping into a new world. I was assigned to sorting incoming shipments, lifting boxes, scanning barcodes, and organizing products. Seemed simple enough. But within an hour, my back was aching, my shirt was damp with sweat, and I realized something. I was way out of my depth. Here's the thing, sitting in an office, reading reports, you think you know what's going on. You see numbers, efficiency rates, shipping times, employee turnover. But when you're actually inside the system, those numbers become real people. Real struggles. For instance, within my first shift, I met a guy named Luis. He'd been there for 5 years, working 10-hour shifts, and still had to pick up side gigs on weekends to make ends meet. He laughed when I asked if he ever talked to management about a raise. Management, he said, shaking his head. They don't even know our names. Oof. That hit hard. But that was just the beginning. The second day was when things really started to sink in. My body was already sore from lifting boxes the day before, and I realized just how physically demanding this job was. The morning shift started at 6 a.m., and by the time I got there, most of the team was already halfway through their coffee, laughing about some inside joke I didn't get. I felt like an outsider, which was a weird feeling since, technically, this was my company. Luis waved me over and gave me a few tips on how to avoid straining my back. You're lifting with your arms too much, he said, demonstrating how to use my legs. You keep doing that, you'll be dead by Friday. He wasn't joking. By lunchtime, I was exhausted, but something interesting happened. I noticed that most of the employees ate in the break room, but one guy, Dan, an older worker who had been there the longest, always ate alone near the loading dock. Curious, I asked Luis about it. He used to be a manager, Luis said, lowering his voice. Got demoted a few years back. He doesn't talk much anymore. That got my attention. I had no idea we demoted longtime managers. I made a mental note to look into it later. The afternoon was even tougher. I got assigned to work with a guy named Jay, who was in charge of checking inventory accuracy. Jay was fast. Ridiculously fast. He could scan and sort a pallet in half the time it took me. He also wasn't shy about letting me know I was slowing him down. Come on, man, he said, barely looking up from his scanner. Gotta pick up the pace, or they'll start docking hours. That made me pause. Docking hours? I played dumb. What do you mean? Jay sighed. If we don't hit quota, they start cutting shifts. They don't fire you. They just stop giving you hours. I had never heard of that happening in my company. I thought we were fair about hours, that people got stable work. But if what Jay was saying was true, then management was using shift reductions as a quiet way to weed people out without officially firing them. That didn't sit right with me. By the time I clocked out, I was exhausted, my hands were sore, and my brain was buzzing with everything I had learned. This wasn't just about efficiency numbers anymore. These were real people trying to survive, and somehow my company, the one I built, had become a place where they felt unheard, replaceable, and constantly at risk of losing their income. I drove back to the cheap motel I was staying at, lay down on the rock-hard bed, and stared at the ceiling. I thought I knew my company. Turns out, I didn't know it at all. The next few days were an education, and not the kind I expected. I went in thinking I'd get a closer look at operations, see where we could be more efficient, maybe find some cost-saving opportunities. Instead, I was getting a crash course in what it actually meant to work here. By day 3, I had stopped trying to act like I knew what I was doing. It was painfully obvious to everyone that I was new, and I think that worked in my favor. People were willing to talk to me, to explain things, and in some cases, vent. One of the first things I learned? The equipment was a mess. I was working alongside a guy named Chris when one of the forklifts started acting up. It wouldn't lift properly, kept stalling out mid-motion. Chris sighed and smacked the side of it like it was an old TV. "Third time this week," he muttered. I asked if we should report it. He actually laughed. "Yeah, you can try. Just don't expect anything to happen." That caught my attention. I had personally signed off on a budget increase for warehouse equipment. New forklifts, better maintenance, the works. Where was that money going? I pressed him a little. "They don't fix these?" Chris shrugged. "They'll come take a look, but unless it's completely dead, they won't replace it. Costs too much." That didn't make sense. We had budgeted for replacements. I was sure of it. It wasn't just the forklifts. The scanners were outdated, the software glitched constantly, and the conveyor belts stalled at least twice a shift. And every time something broke down, it wasn't seen as a problem for management. It was a problem for the workers, because it slowed them down, which meant they got blamed for not meeting quotas. I started keeping a mental list of things to check when I got back to my office. Equipment spending was going to be at the top of it. But the thing that really got me happened later that night. I had finally started to earn a little bit of trust with the team. Luis, Chris, Jay, and a few others invited me to grab food after work. We went to this hole-in-the-wall diner nearby, the kind of place with sticky booths and a waitress who calls everyone Han. I sat there, nursing a cup of coffee, just listening. That's when I heard about Mark. Mark had been one of the guys who trained new hires. By all accounts, he was one of the best workers in the warehouse. Always on time, always willing to help. The kind of employee managers should want to keep. But he had gotten hurt. Slipped on some packing material, messed up his knee bad. Tried to work through it, but eventually, he couldn't keep up. And since he wasn't full-time, just a permanent temp like a lot of the guys, they cut his hours until he had no choice but to quit. No severance. No benefits. Nothing. I was stunned. "Wait, we don't offer benefits to long-term temps?" Jay gave me a look like I had just asked if water was wet. "Dude, you really are new." That hit me like a gut punch. I had always assumed we treated our people well. But somewhere along the way, policies had been put in place that allowed this to happen, probably in the name of cost-cutting, efficiency, streamlining. All those corporate buzzwords I had read in reports, nodding along, never really thinking about what they meant for the people at the bottom. I left the diner feeling sick. I had built this company. I had prided myself on running a business that was fair, that took care of its employees. And yet, here I was, sitting across from people who worked for me, listening to them talk about how they were barely scraping by, how they didn't feel valued, how they were exhausted but scared to say anything because speaking up meant losing hours. And the worst part? Not a single one of them thought it could change. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying everything I had heard, about Mark, the broken equipment, the quiet fear of losing hours. I wanted to believe this was just one warehouse, a bad manager maybe, an isolated case. But deep down, I knew better. This was systemic. This was happening under my nose, and somehow, I had been blind to it. The next morning, I went in with a different mindset. At first, I had been looking at this like an observer, gathering information. Now, I needed answers. It didn't take long to find my next one. Midway through my shift, I saw Luis rubbing his shoulder, wincing as he lifted a heavy box. He had been working way faster than anyone else, which I had noticed on my first day, but now I realized why. He was pushing through pain. "You good?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Yeah," he grunted. "Old injury. Just gotta work through it." That sounded familiar. "You see a doctor?" He shook his head. Can't afford time off. I stop working, I stop getting paid. And there it was again. That quiet, underlying truth I had been hearing over and over. If you weren't 100%, you were expendable. I had heard stories of toxic workplaces before, but I never thought my company was one of them. We had policies. We had HR. We had corporate values framed on the walls of our headquarters. But standing there, watching Luis grit his teeth and push through another shift, I realized something harsh. Policies don't mean a thing if people are too scared to use them. I decided to test this. At lunch, I asked Chris casually, "So, what happens if someone reports an issue? Like, a safety problem or bad equipment?" He smirked. "Oh, you can file a report if you want. But nothing happens." I raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." He leaned in. "Couple months ago, a guy reported a busted conveyor belt. 2 days later, they switched his shifts around so bad he couldn't get childcare. He quit." I felt my stomach turn. "But that's illegal." I was grasping at straws, trying to make sense of it. "Sure," Chris said. "But good luck proving it." I had no idea this was happening. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. I wanted to fix it right now, to call my managers and demand answers. But I couldn't, not yet. I needed to understand why this was happening. Where was the breakdown? Was it middle management? Was it HR policies being ignored? And more importantly, if I had never gone undercover, would I have ever found out? I went back to work that afternoon with a fire in my chest. I was still Mike, the temp worker, but inside, I was the CEO who had failed his employees. I wasn't leaving until I figured out exactly how to fix it. I was done just observing. Now, I was looking for the root of the problem. That afternoon, I started watching my supervisors more closely. I had barely interacted with them up to this point. Most of them stayed in their little glass office near the front, only coming out to make announcements or when something went wrong. But I noticed something interesting. They weren't exactly present. Orders came down from the main office, but the supervisors barely engaged with the workers beyond the basics. They weren't out on the floor checking on things, they weren't listening to concerns, and when they did show up, they mostly just repeated what the system told them. Pick up the pace, quotas slipping, we need to be more efficient. It was like they weren't managing, they were just enforcing. I decided to test something. That evening when my shift was ending, I casually asked one of the supervisors, Mark, not the injured worker, different Mark, how things were looking for next week's schedule. He barely glanced at me. "Check the app. It updates automatically." That was it. No eye contact, no explanation. "Right," I said. "But what if I have questions?" He sighed like I had just asked for his life savings. "Look man, the system updates based on what we need. If your hours change, it's just business. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. There it was. That quiet detachment, like we weren't people, we were just moving parts in a machine. That night, I pieced together what was happening. The warehouse managers weren't bad people. They weren't sitting in their offices twirling their mustaches, scheming to make employees miserable. They were just disconnected. Somewhere along the way, their job had stopped being about managing people and had become about managing metrics. They were following the numbers, adjusting schedules based on algorithms and quotas. They weren't talking to workers, because to them, workers were just data points on a dashboard. And that was my fault. I had created this culture without realizing it. I had approved automation and scheduling systems that optimized for efficiency, but I had never asked at what cost. I had pushed for growth, but I had never stopped to see who was getting left behind. I thought back to all the meetings where I sat in a boardroom, looking at reports that told me everything was running smoothly. Now, I saw how much those reports left out. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't just going to fix policies. I was going to fix the culture. And the first step? Revealing who I really was. I spent the whole night thinking about how to reveal myself. I knew I couldn't just walk in the next morning, throw off my temp worker vest, and announce, "Surprise! I'm the CEO." That wasn't the point of this. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. I wanted to listen. So instead of making a big deal, I decided to do it in the most natural way possible, by pulling my supervisor aside at the end of the shift. The day itself felt surreal. I kept looking around at everyone, knowing that in a few hours, they'd see me differently. Luis, Jay, Chris, even Dan, the guy who had been demoted and kept to himself. These people had opened up to me because I was just another worker. Would they still talk to me once they knew who I really was? Would they still trust me? By the time my shift ended, my hands were sore, my back ached, and my heart was pounding. I found Mark, the supervisor who had brushed me off the day before, and asked if we could talk in private. He looked annoyed at first, probably thinking I was about to ask for more hours or complain about something. But he nodded and led me into his office. I shut the door behind me. Then I took a deep breath and said, "I need to tell you something. My name's not Mike. My name is Redacted, and I'm the CEO of this company." For a full 5 seconds, he didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared. Then he let out a short, breathy laugh, like he was waiting for me to say I was joking. "What?" I pulled out my real ID and set it on his desk. His face drained of color. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was replaying every interaction he'd had with me, every comment, every moment. And I could tell he was panicking. He cleared his throat, trying to collect himself. "Sir, I had no idea. If I had known." I held up a hand. "That's exactly why I did this. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to see things the way they really are. And I did." I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I asked, "Be honest with me. Do you think this warehouse is being run the right way?" He hesitated. I could see the conflict on his face. He knew the right answer, the answer he would have given me if we were in a boardroom, if he was trying to keep his job. But I wasn't asking as his CEO. I was asking as someone who had been here for the past 2 weeks, someone who had seen the exhaustion, the frustration, the fear. Finally, he sighed and sat down. "No," he admitted. "But I don't know how to fix it." And just like that, the wall between us cracked. He wasn't the villain. He was just stuck. I sat down across from him. "Then let's figure it out. Together." And that's when the real conversation began. Mark sat there, still visibly shaken, but as the tension eased, something changed. I could see it in his posture. His shoulders loosened, his hands unclenched. He wasn't looking at me like a CEO anymore. He was looking at me like someone who might actually listen. And so, he started talking. At first, it was cautious, like he was testing the waters. He explained how middle management was stuck between two forces, corporate and the workers. How the pressure to hit quotas came down hard from above, and how if numbers slipped, they were the ones who got called into meetings and written up. "They don't ask what's wrong," he admitted. "They just want the numbers fixed. So we do what we have to do." I already knew what that meant. Cutting shifts. Ignoring equipment requests. Turning a blind eye when workers were struggling because acknowledging it might mean losing their own jobs. It was a broken system, and it was self-sustaining. Everyone, workers, managers, even corporate, was just trying to survive. I let him talk, just nodding, listening. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just took it all in. Finally, when he ran out of words, I leaned forward and said, "That's not how I want my company to run." The words came out heavier than I expected. This was my company. My responsibility. It had gotten this way because, at some point, I stopped looking closely. I trusted the reports, the numbers, the polished presentations in board meetings. But numbers don't show fear. Reports don't show the exhaustion on a worker's face when they realize they might not have a full paycheck next week. I took a deep breath. "Mark, I don't want you to be afraid to do the right thing. And I don't want our workers to feel like they're disposable. But we have to change things at every level to fix that." He nodded, but I could see the skepticism. That's easier said than done. He was right. But I wasn't leaving until I proved I meant it. The aftermath. The next morning, I called a meeting with every single supervisor and manager. I didn't tell corporate yet. I didn't want this to turn into damage control or PR strategy. I wanted real change, and that had to start here. When I walked into the conference room, not as Mike, but as myself, the looks on their faces were priceless. Some went pale. Others shifted uncomfortably. A few had the same reaction Mark did, playing back every interaction we had, wondering what I had seen, what I had heard. I let the silence settle before I spoke. I spent the last 2 weeks working in this warehouse. Not as your boss, but as a temp worker. And what I saw, I paused, shaking my head. What I saw wasn't the company I thought I had built. I didn't sugarcoat it. I talked about the broken equipment, the fear of lost hours, the injury stories, the fact that our so-called efficiency had turned into something toxic. And then, I did something unexpected. I apologized. Not a corporate apology. Not a mistakes were made non-apology. A real one. I failed you, I said simply. I let this company become a place where people are afraid to speak up. Where good workers burn themselves out just to keep their jobs. That's on me. But I'm here now, and I'm going to fix it. There was a long silence. Then finally, someone spoke up. A woman near the back, Jessica, another supervisor, crossed her arms and said, "What does that actually mean? What's going to change?" It was a fair question. Words don't mean much without action. So, I laid out exactly what was going to change. No more cutting hours as punishment. That system was done. If we had staffing issues, we would find real solutions, not force workers into quitting. Equipment and safety requests would be prioritized. I was setting up a direct reporting system so that warehouse workers could submit issues without fear of retaliation. If something was broken, it got fixed. Period. Supervisors needed to be on the floor. No more hiding in offices, staring at numbers. I wanted real leadership. That meant listening to workers, not just enforcing quotas. Long-term temp workers would be offered full-time positions. No more using permanent temp status as a loophole to avoid giving people benefits. If someone had been here long enough to be part of the team, they deserved the security that came with it. An open-door policy with me. I wasn't going to disappear back into my office and hope things improved. I gave them my personal email and said, "If something's broken in this company, if someone is being treated unfairly, I want to hear about it." I could see the doubt on some of their faces. They weren't used to CEOs doing this. They probably thought I'd say all this and then vanish, leaving things exactly as they were. So I made one last thing clear. "I'm not asking you to believe me right now," I said. "I'm asking you to watch. Watch what I do. Watch what changes in the next few months. And if I fail you again, call me out on it." The meeting ended, and I walked out knowing I had just shaken the foundation of how things worked here. 6 months later. The changes weren't easy. There was pushback. Some higher-ups didn't like the shift in policy. Some managers resisted at first, used to the old way of doing things. But slowly, surely, the culture started shifting. Mark became a better leader once he wasn't afraid to advocate for his workers. Luis finally took time off to heal, without losing his job. Jay got promoted, not for speed, but for his leadership skills. And Dan, the guy who had been quietly eating lunch alone after his demotion? I called him into my office, apologized personally, and reinstated him as a manager. Because people shouldn't be discarded just because they hit a rough patch. This experience changed me. I had built a company thinking I knew what was best for my employees. But I had been making decisions from a distance, trusting numbers instead of people. I won't make that mistake again. And to anyone reading this who owns a business, runs a team, or has any say in how people are treated at work, go work alongside your employees. Not for a day. Not as a PR stunt. Really work with them. See what they see. Feel what they feel. Because numbers will never tell you the whole story. But your people will. If you're willing to listen.